Welcome everyone at the GRN's second round webinar for June on disabilities in reading. The first round webinar of GRN for June spotlighted USAID work on inclusive education, and it also highlighted All Children Reading Initiative, which focused on supporting hard of hearing and deaf children in Morocco. Today's webinar will focus on the opportunities and challenges for implementing programs for children with disabilities in reading. We are happy that we have two presenters. Our first presenter is Natasha Graham from UNICEF. She will provide insights on the UNICEF work on inclusive education and opportunities and challenges available for implementing programs on inclusive in reading. Natasha Graham is an international expert in disability and inclusive development, focusing on education of children with disabilities. Having worked for Global Partnership for Education Secretariat, the World Bank, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development on issues related to inclusion of children with disabilities in education, childhood disability screening, and service provision, she is now working with UNICEF headquarters supporting education section in the area of inclusive education for children with disabilities. He has worked with many governments and international agencies on designing, monitoring, and evaluation inclusive education programs. She has extensive experience working in East Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, focusing on understanding the needs of marginalized children and those excluded from education. She holds a master's degree in public administration, specialized in international education policy from the Monterey Institute of International Studies, a graduate school of Middlebury College. A native of Russia, she is a global nomad and an advocate for most excluded. Natasha, you are welcome. Our second presenter is Rebecca Rhodes from USAID, who will provide an overview of USAID strategies, goals for disabilities in reading. Rebecca Rhodes is a senior education officer with USAID. She provides advice on the design, implementation, and monitoring in African languages. She supports the agency efforts in the Middle East to improve reading for children with disabilities. Rebecca, you are warmly welcome. My name, who is speaking, is Aristarick Lyimo from GRN. I'll be moderating this webinar, and if time allows, I will have two questions to our presenters before we take questions from participants. Once again, I welcome all speakers and participants at this webinar. For all participants, if we have technology questions, you will type in the chat box, and we will address it as soon as possible. If it is a question to the speakers, type them in question and answers box. We will gather them and address them at the end. So, welcome everyone again, and I would go straight to Natasha to start her presentation. Welcome, Natasha.
So my name is Natasha Graham, and I'm currently with UNICEF headquarters in New York, working in the education section and covering inclusive education for children with disabilities. When I say inclusive education for children with disabilities, because as you know, inclusive education is actually a larger umbrella, and it includes other children. So I'm mostly focusing on children with disabilities. And I would like to begin my presentation. This is my first time presenting on the issues of children with disabilities in relation to reading. And when we talk about inclusive education and where children with disabilities currently being educated, historically, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what's happening around the world, because I understand that there was a presentation made earlier in the month about this, but I wanted to bring this slide up because it talks about, it shows you 4 different ways of children with disabilities being educated around the world. So that's exclusion, as in children with disabilities are not participating in education. Segregation, that would be special schools. So children with disabilities are participating in education, but they're mostly in special schools. And then integration, that's regular schools with special classes for children with disabilities within regular schools. And then inclusion, so where children with disabilities are able to attend mainstream schools, and they're being educated in the same classrooms. So when we're talking about reading or any kind of learning for children with disabilities, it's important to first understand where is it that they're receiving their education. Because often, for example, if you're looking at segregation or integration, children with disabilities are not using the same curriculum, or they're not as regular children or non-disabled children, and often they're not even taking or they're not participating in learning assessments. So, and then the same thing with inclusive education. The few countries that are practicing inclusion, as in children with disabilities within regular classrooms, very often these children are not included in any type of learning assessments. In fact, I just came back from Ghana, where we were looking at, with the Ministry of Education, at their newly launched inclusive education policy and implementation plan. And when we are looking at the implementation and how is the learning of children with disabilities being measured, often they're not included in examinations. And why that's not happening is because the special accommodations, or government is not able or doesn't know how to make special accommodations for children with disabilities. So therefore, it's really difficult to even measure the progress, and which is necessary to implement a fully inclusive education. So often when we talk about what is inclusive education, there's kind of an umbrella saying that is, say, when every child is welcomed and valued regardless of ability or disability. And I understand that it's very confusing, especially for low-income countries, for their ministries of education. And you could see how this phrase could be misinterpreted in so many different ways. At UNICEF, we say we promote inclusive education, and what we mean by inclusive education is all children go to the same school and are being educated in the same classrooms with special support provided. I decided to include this slide because most of the countries, you could somehow place them in one of the three blocks here, or sometimes it's a combination of all three. Segregation, integration, and inclusion. So as more and more countries are committed to implementing inclusive education, they're somewhere along the spectrum here. There's one thing that I'd like to also mention, that when we talk about inclusive education, a lot of times, from my experience, when you go to especially a low-income country, the Ministry of Education get intimidated because they feel like inclusive education is for wealthy countries or for countries that have a lot more capacity. And when in fact, there's only one country in the world that has only inclusive education, as in all children. There are no special schools, and there are no special classes within regular schools, and that's Italy. So it's really something important, I think, to keep in mind, because inclusion is a process. It's a change in an attitude, but only one country in the world that's actually managed to get rid of all the special schools and all the integrated classrooms within regular schools through radical reforms in the 70s. So when we at UNICEF try to encourage countries or support them in planning for inclusive education policies and action plans, implementation plans, set budgets aside, we always would like to remind them that they're not alone, and most countries are somewhere along the spectrum here. So the core features of inclusive education, I also don't want to spend too much time on this slide, because I understand that that was covered earlier in the month, but that's something within reading. When you're talking about any type of learning or accommodation for children with disabilities, it's the whole systems approach. So a lot of times when we are looking at provision of inclusive education, many countries say, okay, we're going to collect data and we're going to train teachers. But then when you look at what will it take actually to include children with disabilities in education, you have to have there are issues of access for children to actually get to the school, but then also access the curriculum. So, so when you talk about whole systems approach, you really need to look at different aspects of what it takes to include children with disabilities in education. Inclusive education is an attitude, and that's something that in many countries where I work, for example, in Cambodia, where there's so few things that happened for children with disabilities within education, but the shift in attitude started to happen, and that can really move mountains, because when people start seeing children with disabilities as members of society, as children who have equal rights, right to education, then it's not even a lot of times special funding, or it's just an attitude that that starts the change in the process. So when we're talking about inclusive education is an attitude, we have to understand, what does it actually mean? It means that doors to schools, classrooms, and school activities are open to every child, and they're afforded every opportunity to be included with their non-disabled peers. And if you could see here, and you think of the doors for schools to be open. So for example, when children with disabilities, say children with visual impairments, when they get to school, even if the school is required to take that child, but the school teacher is not open to it, the children are not, don't know how to include that child with a visual impairment, or don't want to, or the school administration is not supportive. So that's where attitude is really important, and it becomes important at all levels, whether it's at the Federal Ministry of Education down to the district level and then community level. And then the focus is on giving every child the help he or she needs to learn. So that's really an important point as well, because we're not looking at diagnosing the child as in the previous medical model of disability or understanding disability. We're looking at what type of support the child needs in order for he or she to learn. So a lot of times, of course, a teacher plays a really important role, but on top of having a teacher with specialized training, you need to make sure that the teacher has access to things that are being used in the classroom, to textbooks, to also a child has access to assistive devices. So we're basically refocusing from focusing on the child to focusing on what the child will need in order for him to succeed. We'll not go too much into historical context, but I wanted to leave these next couple of slides in my presentation, because it's important to not forget the history of exclusion and institutionalization, because in fact many countries are still, when we were doing a review of the information that was coming from our country offices at UNICEF, we found that in fact institutionalization is still happening of children with disabilities, and in some countries it's on the rise. As special schools are closing, more institutions are being opened, and those are specialized boarding facilities, and often they don't offer very little in terms of education for children with disabilities, but just something to keep in mind, the history of exclusion and institutionalization. Then lack of common definitions of disability, and we have inadequate data on prevalence. For example, if you look at household data, a lot of times disability prevalence is 2%, or 3%, 4%, very low, which makes it, the governments feel like it's not a priority, or it's such a small number, it's not something they need to focus on. High levels of stigma and discrimination, that's across cultures, different countries are experiencing this. And then rigid medicalized systems of assessment and labeling. For example, in countries where the health systems are not very robust, and children with disabilities are not getting the screening or assessment or access to assistive devices when they get to school. So for example, if a child with low vision, or the child who cannot hear well, gets to grade 1 and has never been assessed, and by the end of the school year, if the child is still in school, most of the times, and that's what I've seen a lot happen in Southeast Asia with with enrollment rates being in 90–95%, children with disabilities are all coming to school, but they're not able to stay in school, or they're labeled as slow learner, put in a slow learner category because assistive devices are not available. The emergent situation, also I left this slide because the UNICEF very heavily relies on the Convention on the Rights of a Child and a Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and we also like to remind countries that most countries ratified the convention, and which means that they are committed to implementing inclusive education, because that's the Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities actually calls for access to inclusive education for children with disabilities. Most countries we see now have initiatives to promote inclusive education, but then I'd like to go back to my first slide, where I talked about segregation and inclusive education, and in special schools, where it's often when countries say we are working towards implementing inclusive education, they don't always mean inclusive education in the way that is specified in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Often inclusive education, but you actually, what's happening at the classroom level is children with disabilities may be going to the same school, but they're not educated in the same classroom. I will go quickly through this slide, that the institutionalization is still quite common, especially young children, and the rate is increasing in some countries. And one of the saddest things that I've seen is that the institutionalization in historical context, in the 70s and the 80s, a lot of children with moderate to severe disabilities ended up in institutions. But now we actually see higher rates of children with mild disabilities, for example, visual impairments or hearing problems, ending up in institutions, because we're in a way raising awareness about the situation of children with disabilities, so therefore they're being picked up and then sent away to institutions. And children with disabilities, as you know, are still widely excluded from education, and when they are included, often no adequate accommodations are being made, so they're included per se. They can come to school, they know that they can go to school, but once they get to the classroom, they're not being provided with support that's needed for them to succeed. So this is UNESCO's definition of inclusion. It's from 2005, and it still is very much stays the same, and that's the definition that we at UNICEF are using. Then the Convention on the Rights of the Child and CRPD. So a lot of the work that we're doing at UNICEF, we're very much embedding it into what is being defined in the convention. And I wanted to bring attention to the Article 24 on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And there's now, we've adopted a general comment on what does it actually mean to provide inclusive education, which is quite a useful tool for advocating for development partners, for example, for advocating for inclusive education. What is needed? There was one thing that I wanted to focus on when we talk about what is needed at the global level, what is needed at the country level, what is needed at the development partner level. For example, there was a meeting of all the development, or many development partners working in inclusive education in Berlin in March of this year, where we discussed how development partners can support countries interested in working towards inclusive education. So we talked about addressing access, quality, and respect for rights. So we all know that these are things that need to be done or addressed in order for children with disabilities to participate or be included in education, but it's the how-to that's often missing. It's the how do we provide access to children with disabilities? What do we mean by access? And respecting the rights of children with disabilities, what rights, and governments aware of the rights, and how can governments, what can they do to respect the rights of children with disabilities? For example, in Ghana last week, we discussed what policies and laws are in place at the government level to support the inclusion of children with disabilities in education, and how are they being implemented, and what programs or projects actually support implementation of these policies. So this is an interesting slide because at UNICEF, we decided a couple of years ago that we need to understand from our country offices what countries are doing in respect to inclusion of children with disabilities in education. So we've asked, it's a standard monitoring questionnaire that goes to over 140 countries, and we pretty much received something that we expected to receive, but it was interesting to see. For example, we've asked countries to provide a score of what they think, and that's usually UNICEF's education units or education offices within each country. We asked them, is there, for example, an inclusive education policy in the country that you're working, or what's being done to provide access to the actual physical environment? Is there anything that's being done to provide children with disabilities with materials? Then human resources, teachers being trained in inclusive practices. What about school administrators? The attitudes, what is the general attitude towards children with disabilities and towards their rights to education? And then also looking at inclusive education, education management information systems, so that's the in-school data collection. How many of them are actually including children with disabilities? Therefore, for example, data on student learning assessments, and how are these assessments accommodating children with disabilities? That would be included in the EMIS system. Or how many children with disabilities are in the school? Is this data disaggregated by the type of disability? So it was very interesting to see that the key implementation is always issue is implementation at the school level. So even when you have policies in place, and a country may hire an expert or a consultant or an advisor to advise them to help create a good policy, but then what happens at the implementation level, at the school level? What happens at the community level? So that's usually a lot of the bulk of the issues concentrated at that level. And in fact, we did an EMIS study, so we looked at EMIS systems in 40 countries, 40 plus countries, and we found out that 20 countries don't even include children with disabilities in their data collection systems, which is really concerning. For example, when we're talking about measuring their reading, their inclusion in any kind of school activities, their access to school, do they come on a regular basis, do they drop out? Children with disabilities are often excluded completely from EMIS systems. So based on the information that we received from the countries, we decided to focus all of our efforts on 7 overall strategies. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to go really quickly. So you will have my presentation later, and if anyone has questions, you can ask me about specific things that we're doing for each of the 7 strategies. But we're working on around knowledge generation and data collection, dissemination of evidence and advice, development of guidance and tools, advocacy and promotion, partnerships, building capacity, and supporting implementation. And the actual, the bulk of the work we're doing is with the Global Partnership for Education, where we've created sort of we've helped them to we were leading a consultation on the new strategic plan for Global Partnership for Education, where we connected with a lot of development partners, disabled person organizations, NGOs, INGOs, community members, teachers, school administrators, and we've asked them what's missing, what's working well. And so based on that, we've found out that a big issue, again, is capacity, is the how inclusive education can be implemented at the school level. So we've developed 14 technical booklets or webinars, in addition to webinars, on different topics. For inclusive education, we've now had them translated into a variety of languages: Arabic, Russian, French, and Spanish. We're now in the process of not simplifying, but creating a more a less dense version for low-income countries that are just starting, because the 14 technical booklets and webinars are targeting mostly middle-income or low middle-income countries. So we're creating a set of capacity-building materials for low-income countries. We've also produced an inclusive image guide, which is quite popular because a lot of countries are requesting guidelines on how and what should be done to include children with disabilities in image systems. We're also working at UNICEF with Mix 6, so that's the module on child function and disability, so that's the data collection. We've produced inclusive education program guidelines, and all of this, by the way, is available not just for UNICEF, but it's a global. All of these are global goods, so anyone is welcome to use them. And then the most recent one, and that's why I was in Ghana, we produced a chapter. So all countries now that are global partnership, receiving funding from Global Partnership for Education, are required to produce education sector plans and analyze their existing education sector. So that they have to do the education sector analysis. And we have produced a chapter on inclusive education of education sector analysis. So that's basically how does one look at the education system, the entire system, through an inclusive lens. And so we're piloting this in Ghana, the chapter on education sector analysis, methodological guidelines on inclusive education, and the guide will be available for all countries to use by the end of this year. We also have an accessible learning materials initiative, and that would be mostly used in classrooms, of course, and that's large print textbooks, assistive devices, and then learning materials that are used by teachers. We're also providing training courses and workshops. We are in September having a regional inclusive education conference for East Africa region. In November, we're having one for West Africa. And we are supporting a number of countries in country offices that are supporting ministries of education and trying to come up with even a country strategy of what to do in that particular country. And then the big item on the agenda for the remaining part of the year is we're creating a community of practice like the one you have in Reading, but for inclusive education. And we most likely will base the topics or the themes that we'll be covering is on the methodological guidelines on education sector analysis for inclusive education. So that's several different sections, and we'll be providing training and capacity building events as part of this community of practice. I've included all the links and to everything that I talked about. I know it was a really brief overview, but I'll stop here with my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natasha, for your great presentation. And now I welcome Rebecca Rhodes to highlight on USAID strategies and goals for disabilities in reading. Madam Rebecca, you are welcome.
Thank you so much, Lyimo, and thank you to Natasha and to the Global Reading Network, and also to our participants, to whom I offer what I can as an apology. This turns out to be a day where I am in rural Haiti with no connection except a phone line. So I will talk you through what we have been working on at USAID and what our general direction and thinking is at this time. And I appreciate your listening to that. I will try to be as concise as I can. I think in what I have to say, you will hear a lot of echoes of what Natasha has just explained. So I want to start by essentially repeating some of those very important things that she highlighted. We also believe at USAID that inclusive education is very much an attitude, that it has to start anything that we do in reading to ensure that all children, including children who learn differently, can read. That has to begin by having the attitude that it is possible for this to happen and for those children to learn how to read. You will also hear in what I will explain about the agency's work echoes of Natasha's points about using models that are not medical models. We want our development models to be oriented around identifying the appropriate supports to enable all children to read, not about diagnosing or labeling a particular disability. I have a lot of issues, as many people do with that word, but a particular style or a particular way of learning, but to focus on what support is needed so that an individual can acquire this essential skill. And then, as Natasha had said, that obliges us to look at how to provide every opportunity to achieve this and to look at a whole systems approach. So within the reading team, we are moving in these directions. Having said that, I need to admit to everyone on the webinar that this for us is essentially very new terrain. Everyone will remember that USAID began its focus on reading in 2011, and for a long time we were only able to begin to introduce very basic concepts around that were not specific to populations that might have specific reading needs or support needs to learn to read. So our work with teaching children with disabilities to read really, as you I think may have heard in the earlier webinar this month, dates back to essentially the end of 2013 and the beginning of 2014, when we began to look at each other and feel guilty that we would publish requests for proposals that always said, oh, ensure that children with disabilities can learn to read, but we were not providing any of the types of guidance that Natasha has described. We were not offering to any of our partners any real tools for how to do what we were saying had to be done. And basically, if truth be told, we were, giving lip service to an idea, but we weren't putting any effort behind it ourselves, and therefore putting our partners in a position where it was very difficult for them to put an effort behind it. So that our motivation comes from wanting to change that reality. We are very much committed to moving forward, however difficult it may be, into addressing these questions that Natasha raised. How do you implement instruction at the school level for children with disabilities so that they are able to learn to read? So this is our perspective at this time as an agency and as a reading team. But as I say, this is a very new area for us of exploration and of focus in our work. We do begin, and if I had slides to show you, this would be a slide. We do begin with the perspective that from a neurological standpoint, all brains can achieve what we at the moment describe as basic or functional reading skill. So this is a belief to which we commit. We know that learning to read is very much a process of teaching your brain to do a certain number of functions that enable you to understand what you see as a printed symbol. And we think that with the right support and with the right instruction, all brains can achieve this to a basic or functional level. Working off of this belief, like UNICEF, we are beginning to investigate a certain number of categories of what we think of as areas of inquiry for us within the programs that we fund. And I think you'll see a lot of overlap in what I'm about to say with the 7 strategies that Natasha described. So we are asking very specifically now that the partners with whom we work and that the organizations that we fund begin to look at the degree to which children with disabilities in the communities where we are working have the ability to access and participate in education when they are very young. So our 4-year-olds, our 5-year-olds, our 6-year-olds who are deaf or hard of hearing, blind or low vision, somehow cognitively different, are they being allowed by their parents, by their community, by the adults around them to come to a school and to participate, or are they being kept at home? For us, this is the very first essential question. It's a bit of a step removed from are they being taught reading, but it is the first piece of data that we have to have and that we have to understand. So access and participation is becoming, in the solicitations we write and in the work that we fund, more and more of a focus of data collection for us about the children that we are trying to serve. Another area of focus for us, another area of inquiry as we've framed it for the moment, and again, I appeal to everyone to realize that this is really a work in progress for us, and we are really looking for input on how to make it better. But another area of inquiry for us is networks, and to what degree in each context, in each country, where we are working on teaching children to read, are there already networks of organizations who are devoted to supporting learning for disabled populations and supporting access to learning for disabled populations? Everywhere that we have so far been able to ask this question, we have been, of course, overwhelmed by discovering the number of resources that may be available in a country, although possibly not in a particular area of that country. And we've come to realize that we have done a very poor job as an agency of supporting our partners to find out where these networks are and who they are and how they can be accessed or expanded to support the children who are attending the schools where we finance work in reading. So improving our intersections with these networks is for us on the reading team an essential area of inquiry because we know that that's part of providing the support that each child will need to be able to learn to read. The next area of inquiry that I want to discuss is what we've labeled as the institutional capacity for needs assessment and response. And again, this links back very much to what Natasha described as a whole systems approach. So if I am, let's say, for example, in Haiti, one of the things I need to understand is how has the Haitian ministry understood and interpreted the kinds of conventions and laws that may be in effect in the country, and how have they then built or not built any capacity to assess student need in terms of what supports are required to teach reading and to respond to those needs. And we're developing tools, we're beginning to develop a set of tools around this. I think one of the tools that you've heard described in some detail is the early grade reading assessment for deaf children, which I know has been highlighted in the discussions on our work in Morocco. But that would only be one tool for one type of population and would only be a small piece of what might become in the longer run a toolkit for looking at whether a given country had the institutional capacity for needs assessment and response that would be required in order to be able to teach every child to read. Our next area of inquiry, not surprisingly, is teacher and administrator preparation and training. This links directly back again to the 7 strategies that Natasha mentioned and to the work that UNICEF is doing on guidance and tools. It's very obvious to us that we have not addressed in any of the work that we've done beyond the work on the early grade reading assessment for the deaf in Morocco, we really have not effectively addressed what you say to a teacher or what you say to a school director when you are talking about figuring out what support is needed for the children in the classes that are differently abled and that need a certain pedagogical approach or a certain number of assistive devices to be able to learn basic reading skills. And we have to really all take responsibility for going back through our teacher and administrator training support modules and figuring out what we are going to include in them so that there are some really clear, helpful guidelines for the people who are in the school context attempting to provide this instruction in reading to children who have different sets of abilities. Logically then, following on from that, our next area of inquiry is classroom management. So this gets into the nuts and bolts of exactly as Natasha was saying, how do you make sure that children who are mobility challenged are able to actually move around the room and interact with their peers? How do you make sure that children who are working either with an aid or with a certain device have the type of support and teaching that they need to use those inputs to the best of their ability? And how does somebody who is the head teacher of that classroom actually manage these interactions such that the instruction and learning can occur for all who are present? And again, these are all these areas of inquiries that I'm listing are ones that, you know, to admit to everyone here, we've literally, you know, kind of scratched on the backs of envelopes and have begun to use as a structure for guiding an agency-led inquiry into these areas so that we better understand how we can use resources to support this work. The next and last area of inquiry, but most important, I think, that I would highlight here is our area of inquiry around pedagogy. And so what does this teaching really look like? We have a few things identified that we are trying to roll out in a few programs, and we're very much in a testing and evaluation mode around those. Clearly for us in the reading domain, the very first thing that we recognize has to be in place is that there does need to be a strong core reading program in the country. You need to have reading instruction occurring for children in general already. And of course, as we all know, we have many contexts where that is not yet truly functional and happening. But you need to get that introduced because you can only identify children who are differently abled and having difficulty learning to read once you know that you have introduced a reading program that by and large is evidence-based and follows research to a sufficient degree to be able to teach a good portion of the children to read. It's only once you have that in place that you can begin to differentiate and recognize which are the children that need the additional support or different instruction to master the same skills. So our ideas around pedagogy include introducing these very evidence-based, clear, simple, scripted reading programs, identifying which children are not able to profit from those in the ways that we would want, and then orienting resources to either provide them with the correct assistive devices, provide them with the aids, or provide them with the instructional routines that will enable them to learn to read. And when we talk about those instructional routines, we're talking about such ideas as increased time to repeat and practice skills. We're talking about skill-based grouping, which has been shown for certain children, mostly unfortunately in Western contexts, to be very effective in terms of helping those with some type of learning disability to learn to read. We're talking about very directed and heavily scripted objectives-based instruction so that each reading objective can be broken down into the smallest possible units, and that then those units can be walked through with those children either by the classroom head teacher or the classroom head teacher working with an aide or a parent volunteer who is able to come in and to go over those particular reading units with the particular children who have been identified as needing them. And these are things that even in very well-resourced contexts do not always go well, and so the challenge in front of us in the programs that we're designing and funding is to introduce and then monitor some of these pedagogies so that we can really, in this area of inquiry, understand what is the best investment based on context and based on need And, you know, I think everybody has heard me say, having worked on this only for essentially a little over a year, we're very early on in this inquiry, and we're really looking to expand our understanding of this as we move forward in our reading team and in our agency. And then once we think of these, once we step away from the areas of inquiry and think of project work in general, you know, our clear priority here on our team is to acquire enough data about these investments so that we are able to say something clear about the processes used in the different programs and the outcomes achieved so that we can continue to improve the sorts of guidance and toolkits that one might want to produce to discuss these very particular portions of the pedagogical models. And that those pieces of guidance would then become a complement to guidance offered about other systems level questions. So what is actually happening now for us is that we have the work that you've heard about in Morocco with the use of the early grade reading assessment for deaf children. That work has also been expanded to Rwanda, and we have several other countries that are interested in using that. And then just this past 2 months, we have issued new awards in Cambodia, Nepal, and Malawi. And those 3 awards are structured to try to capture these areas of inquiry and to try to capture these opportunities for intervention, such that there is an institutional capacity piece of each of those awards where the awardee is asked to look at the degree to which the ministry and the system as a whole is able to operationalize agreements and understandings and commitments around inclusive education and education for children and people with disabilities. There is a classroom component where we are asking awardees to apply some of these pedagogies and to apply some of these assistive techniques. I don't like the word techniques, but these assistive, opportunities, so that we can see whether they are able to actually put in place classrooms that do serve simultaneously children who are differently abled and children who are following the routine reading program. And then in each of those 3 awards, there is also a family and community component where what we're looking for, obviously, is data on what can be done in the communities and in the families to really begin to advance this idea that inclusive education is an attitude and that learning to read is something that everybody can learn to do to at least a basic or functional level, and that families and communities have a responsibility and a role to play in assisting all children to achieve that. And we're trying to see what each of those awardees will propose and what they will succeed in doing in terms of working with families and communities around those ideas. So if we then take one further step back and think about all of these things and think about the areas of inquiry being children's access and participation, connections between schools and classrooms and networks of support for people with disabilities, the institutional capacity for needs assessment and response so that everyone can learn to read, teacher and administrator preparation and training so that everyone can learn to read, classroom management, how-to tools and guidance so that reading instruction can be organized for all, and then pedagogy so that there is an appropriate pedagogical input for each child. What we're trying to do as an agency is to answer a pretty complicated question, which is what are the investments in each of our contexts that are most effective for improving reading outcomes for differently abled children, and what do we do to help our partner ministries and to, as an agency, commit funding, recognize the reality of the given costs behind this work, and analyze those costs and seek just-in-time solutions for them, rather than pretending that they can be sort of an add-on at the end in a paragraph to a given piece of work. We're also trying, as we move forward with this, to respect some of the principles that Natasha listed earlier. For example, within the disabled community, the principle of nothing about us without us. We're trying very hard to encourage our partners to really have their interactions on the ground be part of the movements that we see in these different countries around changing education to include children who are differently abled, and so that we can have input from the different organizations and networks and coalitions that have already been addressing this question. Since we feel that we're a little bit late to the table, we're trying to make up for lost time. And then as a part of that, as an agency, we're working very hard to become more active in those types of networks that already exist, and to become more aware of conventions and commitments that may be in place either internationally or within a given country. And so that our job is to then look at our own resource allocations and the allocations of resources within our partner governments, so that we really can align the monies that are needed to ensure that the reading instruction that is provided reaches every last child. So that's a very long way of talking you through how we're thinking about this as an agency, talking you through where we're trying to apply this work in Morocco, Rwanda, Cambodia, Nepal, and Malawi, and recognizing for you that we are very much in the middle of this work. It is a work in progress, and we consider ourselves fortunate to, be connecting better with Natasha and UNICEF and potentially the GPE and certainly other donor organizations and partners on these questions, because we won't really achieve our mission without delving into these details and coming up with some clear answers for how we spend our money as a donor agency, and then the type of evidence-based work that we can build on the ground in our different areas of inquiry. So I'll stop there for now and turn it back over to you, Lyimo. And I'm happy to take questions, or if anything was unclear, I'm happy to try to clarify from here in rural Haiti.
Thank you, Rebecca, for your wonderful presentation. It was very nice to hear from UNICEF and USAID at this webinar. I will skip my section of asking some questions to you, and I would like to go straight to the question which has been asked by the participants due to time limit. And so far we have a question from Julia McGowan. She's thanking Natasha for his presentation, and she's saying she's an inclusive education technical advisor for Handicap International. She's asking, do you know when the new module on barriers will be out? I'm already promoting the use of the child module. This is the question from Julia. Let me see if there's another question before we go to that. Another one is a comment. So Natasha, can you respond to that question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. The guidelines on barriers, you're talking about the assessed and inclusive environment, I believe. We have the draft module now. It hasn't been tested. So I'd be happy to share that, but I think the idea was for MIX to test it first, and it hasn't been done yet. And in fact, we were trying to use to see if we can include that as part of the EMIS assessment in Ghana. So I'd be happy to share the actual document, the guide, the questions, but it hasn't been properly tested yet, so we cannot say that these are all the final questions.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. I don't see another question, but maybe I read this comment that this is from Jerry Minders. This is the most refreshingly candid and thorough presentation on inclusive education that I have ever heard from USAID in the past 2 decades. Thank you, Rebecca, and the team that has been assembled to put this forward. So that's a comment from one of our participants. Yes, there is another question here. Oh, what does it say? Yes, this is from, sorry, let me pick. Thank you for presenting, Rebecca. In regards to EGRA for hearing impaired and the sign language teaching tools, when will those be available for general use in Morocco? And how can these tools be accessed? This is a question to Rebecca.
That's an excellent question, and we are moving forward as quickly as we can with that. Our plan is to finish the pilot test that's happening in Rwanda just now, and then we will have a little bit like what was described by Natasha. We will then have a French and Arabic and an English and a Kinyarwanda version. And those we hope will be something that, in fact, the Global Reading Network will be able to post and make accessible for the public. We're hoping by the beginning of probably September or late September. We just need a couple more months to finish that up.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. I don't see another question, and our time is over. So I would like to thank you very much, the two presenters, Rebecca and Natasha, and also all participants who have attended to this webinar. So we welcome you again in the following webinar, which will focus in fragile in reading context. So visit our Global Reading Network website to take note of the dates and also who will present and who will be our discussant. Thank you very much for your presentation. In case we receive more questions regarding our webinar today, we will send them to our presenters, to Rebecca and Natasha, for answers, and then we will post them to our blog, to GRN's blog. Once again, thank you very much. I wish you all the best. Enjoy your work.
Thank you, Lyimo. Thank you, Natasha, and thanks, everyone.
Thank you.